today when people mention the word Germanna, the first thing that comes to mind usually is the community college. And then when I start talking to people about the history of this area, very few people know very much about it. Some people might say, oh, the Civil War. A few people might remember that Alexander Spotswood built a home, but most people don't truly understand the full breadth of history that occurred on this peninsula here. And here are just a few of the things that the name Germanna has been associated with in the historic past. There's Germanna the fort, Germanna the mansion, Germanna the town, Germanna the ford, Germanna the ferry, Germanna the bridge, Germanna the plantation, and Germanna the mill. So it is not just one occupation, it is actually many occupations. And not only does it have historic occupations, since I'm going to be talking about archaeology, I should mention that the Germanna property also has hundreds of prehistoric sites on it as well. So people have known about this area for tens of thousands of years and have lived on it and enjoyed the property. Tonight I'm primarily going to be concentrating on Germanna the mansion, the Enchanted Castle site. When Alexander Spotswood decided to build another home outside of the colonial capital, he decided to build it here at Germanna. And as I go through this, I think you're going to start seeing that some of the items that we see here are directly correlate with the buildings in Williamsburg. Now there he spent the colony's money, but he obviously decided that put his own panache onto how they appeared. So what we have at Germanna then is all of these same elements. He kind of picked and chose his favorite elements from what he built down in Williamsburg, and he put them all together at his own home here at the Enchanted Castle. First of all, the name of the Enchanted Castle. I do refer to it as that because in 1732 William Byrd visited the site and he called it the Enchanted Castle. Now he obviously was kind of saying it tongue-in-cheek, didn't really mean it was an enchanted castle, but colloquially throughout the 19th and into the 20th century this site has been known as the Enchanted Castle, and that's why I refer to it that today. Not necessarily to talk about how exactly what Spotswood referred to it, because we're not exactly sure, but also to give a nod to cultural memory of this place, because for many hundreds of years it has been known as the Enchanted Castle. Some basic thoughts on what the home looked like or how it was constructed. I believe it was begun around 1718, and I think it was completed about 1724, about a 6-year construction period, which is about typical for the first half of the 18th century. If it was begun in 1718, it could be the oldest privately owned Georgian mansion in Virginia, and has been also mentioned almost positively the oldest Georgian mansion in the Piedmont. It was very early. Archaeological evidence shows that the mansion was very, very different than anything else that had been constructed before or anything that was constructed afterward. And that's primarily going to be the gist of the rest of my talk tonight, to talk about what these differences are and what that might mean. And what it might mean is that we might have a better idea of exactly who built this home. Because here we are, at that time, very much on the edge of the frontier, and this monument was built toward Alexander Spotswood. And the question was, how was it built? How was it put together? Where did they get the materials? And how did it come about? And the last thing I'm going to talk about tonight is the future of archaeology at Germanna, and what can we learn and where should we be going from here. Before we dive into the archaeology, the question I brought up a minute ago is Georgian. And now I know a lot of people, when they start thinking about the word Georgian, you think about some of the more monumental plantation manor homes, such as Salubria, such as Westover. And indeed, those are part of the Georgian style. Georgian is actually an umbrella term for many aspects that were going on. It's kind of, I can say it's kind of like the term Victorian. You know how the term Victorian can mean a style of architecture, it can mean a style of clothing, it can mean a way of life, it can mean many, many things, how people related to each other, style of government. All those things fall under the auspice of a certain Victorian ideology, and Georgian is the same way. People in the very beginning of the 18th century had taken the step into the new century wanting to make new advances. Before this time, they were so bound by natural conditions and by their own limitations. They were dying to take part and take hold of themselves, their buildings, and all of their business enterprises. And this big shift in a mindset occurred where all of a sudden people said, we don't want to be held back by nature or be controlled by nature, we want to do the controlling. And so the architecture dramatically changes from more of the colonial, more of the vernacular, unsymmetrical, to something that's very symmetrical, something that's very balanced and something that's very controlled. Government, again, slightly changes at the same time. Clothing changes, the way we eat, the way we use plates, all changed at this time with this notion to establish more control of our lives. So when I talk about Georgian, that's what I'm talking about. It's not just the architectural style, but it's more of a larger ideology change at the early 18th century. Let's talk about what the archaeological has happened out there before. Has anyone seen Doug Sanford or anyone talk about the archaeology out there? Just one or two? Great, well, you'll learn a lot tonight then, a lot of you who haven't seen it yet. Archaeology at the Enchanted Castle site. First, I'll show a little bit where it is. Obviously, you have the big horseshoe bend that Rob pointed out earlier, and on that bend, there are many historical elements. What you know today as Route 3 is actually a relatively new alignment. It was built in the 20th century. Before that time, the old Germanna Road actually led to what was the town and the home of Germanna. So it actually bowed further up the hill and then went back down to Germanna Ferry or Germanna Ford, two separate places. The place we're going to be talking about is the Enchanted Castle site, which is circled in blue. But I think it's important to note how this road came up toward it and where it's located on the larger peninsula, because it shows geographically what you're dealing with here. I jokingly call this Spotswood Kingdom because of him is when it was founded. We had the fort come in 1714. By 1718, the fort had become too small for the amount of people who were here, and for Spotswood's own idea and for Spotswood's own britches, if you will. He couldn't quite fit into the fort anymore. And so the fort came down, and he started building his own mansion at the site. When the Spotsylvania County was created in 1720, Spotswood, of course, decided, I know where the county seat should be. It should be on my place. The county's named after me. It's all about me. So he therefore built the town of Germanna directly adjacent to his home. The town of Germanna by 1724 had a courthouse, it had a church, it had a tavern. It had homes, it had supposedly it started having buildings of fountains, it had roads. It was pretty much a thriving town. So much so that one traveler passing through it said that actually he thought Germanna was going to be larger and more prosperous than Williamsburg very soon. Now, obviously there's nothing left of it now, but it's all still there underground. Spotswood built his home so that he could actually overlook the town of Germanna and overlook the ferry. Again, that's why I jokingly call it his kingdom, because he was kind of on the high, the man or the king, looking down upon his fiefdom down below him. Archaeological excavations have concentrated on the Enchanted Castle site itself, the home site, rather than the town site or anything else, for several reasons. The site was first recorded in 1969, and then in the 1970s, 1977 to be specific, a local developer purchased the property and decided he wanted to build his own home directly on top of the Enchanted Castle site. Obviously, this caused a great uproar amongst the historic and archaeological communities, and they rushed out there between 1977 and 1978 to get some archaeology done. They call it salvage archaeology. In other words, someone's going to build on top of it. Let's find out what information we can. So it's a very specific type of archaeology that was conducted by the VRCA, Virginia Research Center for Archaeology, now known as the Virginia Department of Historic Resources. They went out there and they basically stripped the topsoil to try to expose the foundation of his home. Figured, we've got to find something, we've got to figure out what we can do. Now in 1978, just after they had begun their salvage work, the owner, under political pressure, basically said, okay, fine, I won't build my home here, and he decided to move on. Temporarily, the crisis was averted. Then comes 1984, and the exact same thing happens. A new owner comes and says, it was a great spot. I want to build my home right on top of this knoll. And it was the Enchanted Castle site. This gentleman went so far as to actually dig the basement of his home, and therefore he actually did remove a lot of the 19th century archaeology at the site. But once again, after he dug this big, huge hole up there, the site was once again rescued, and it was protected, and it was actually purchased by Historic Gordonsville Association. After that time, from 1984 onward, the site was officially protected, 62 acres of property. Once that had happened, once the site was no longer going to be under someone's house, people said, okay, let's take a step back. Let's do this a little more slowly, a little more systematically, and they therefore set up an academic dig, which means that things are done in grid systems. You need to have exact control over everything that came out of the ground. It was a very different type of archaeology. So UVA and Mary Washington College, from 1985 to about 1995, on and off, conducted excavations at this site. I should note that the Historic Gordonsville in the late 1980s did give the property to Mary Washington College to be under their tutelage and under their stewardship, and they still own the property today. 1995, excavations basically ceased due to many things in life. They ran out of money, and once you run out of money, you can't do any more out there. This is the grid system that was set up over the Enchanted Castle site, the home site, by Mary Washington College. Each of those squares is a 10-foot square, so you can see how big the site truly is. It's actually very, very big, very large. Of those, 71 units were actually excavated. The rest of them, they set the grid up, but they did not actually dig down into them yet, so there's still much to be done out at this site. The archaeological excavation showed that Spotswood's home was what's called a 9-part Palladian plan, very typical of the Georgian style. And what that means is there are 9 buildings, or 9 portions that make up the complex of his home. You see the main square up at the top of the center, that's his main house. And to give you a better idea of what scale we're talking about, that's 90 feet by 40 feet. It's a very, very large home. The other things that surround it, the 4 items, these are called hyphens. Here and here, those are called hyphens. And hyphens are basically the walkways. They can be enclosed or they can be open, but they are the walkways to go from the main house to your outbuildings or your dependencies. There are 4 of those, and then there were 4 dependencies or outbuildings. Now the reason the right side is dotted in is because we do have archaeological evidence that they existed in some form, but because of the 19th century occupation of the site and the later 1984 digging of the basement, those area over there has been compromised. So we believe that they're still there, but they have not exactly been explored yet because of that reason. We have found very specific concrete evidence, however, for the main house and the western portion of the site. So it is huge. This thing was absolutely enormous, as you can see. This is what we have left of the main house. The basement is what we have, and it's full of 3 to 5 feet of rubble. Quite a feat when you're out there digging in 100-degree weather in the summer. As you can see exactly how deep this rubble is by some of these features. This is the rubble, this thick. This is the bottom of the basement floor. I'll show you a few more slides in a moment to give you a better idea of it. The archaeological excavation comprised excavating all of that rubble, which is basically what the house is built in, that had all fallen in, and taking it all out and trying to look at the basement to figure out how the home was put together, how it was used, who might have worked in what spaces, and so forth. What you see here is the center of the home. There's a cross-shaped fireplace right in the center, which means you had 4 fireplace openings for 1 chimney stack, so it's actually pretty economical way to build. You build 1 stack and you have 4 openings, you can have 4 fires going at once. There's also a drain that you'll see, and I'll show you a better slide of it in the center, showing that a little more advanced construction and some better idea of what they were dealing with in natural conditions. Here's how the home was built, and it's very, very intriguing. Most homes at this time, most mansions, I should say at this time, were built using brick, and only brick. You might have had a stone embellishment or 2, but it was almost completely brick. The Enchanted Castle was built probably about 75% of stone. It's very, very unique building material. We just don't see it anywhere else. Now, any of you who live around here, you know that what your soil is clay. You have that bright, orange, hard clay. So the question then becomes, if you have this bright, orange, hard clay, which is perfect for making bricks, why would you build in stone? But keep that in mind as we go through this. But you can see how it was built. They had a builder's trench, so you build a big hole, and then you lay your stone and your brick inside your trench, and that's what builds your wall. So we have a very good idea of how the building was put together out there. This is a close-up of the cross-shaped chimney to give you a better idea. We talked about the rubble that fell inside. You can kind of see it here. You see it in outline. This is what it looked like when the archaeologists came across it. It was basically flat. You can sort of see what we're going to be dealing with here. When they remove 3 feet of rubble, that's what it looks like. You have a center stone fireplace is actually made of a material called schist. And schist is a local stone, but it's very, very friable. It's almost like a mica. So you can flake it off and it's very, very friable, but when you turn it on its side or you use it in particular ways, it's a very strong building material. No other home we know of is built using this schist, this very unique material. But you can see, actually it's pretty interesting, to get a great also view of the basement floor, which is paved in brick pavers, which are probably made locally. Here's a close-up of that drain I mentioned. That's another interesting feature. Even though your floor is made of these brick pavers, the drain is lined with stone as well. So they're starting to use stone in very, very curious ways, ways we haven't seen at any other home. Very little wood has been found. And the reason very little wood has been found is because the Enchanted Castle burned. We believe it burned sometime in the 1750s. After it burned for the first time and no one lived in it, people then began to rob the building materials. Think about it, you have this big hulking shell with all this great material. You're going to go and take what you need because no one's living in it, no one's using it anyway. So people went in, they took what they wanted to, and when they couldn't get to any more, they burned it again so that more things kind of shift up. And then they took what they wanted, then they burned it again. We probably have about 5 or 6 burning episodes here at the Enchanted Castle, which, yes, are each excavated individually in slow, monotonous layers. But what we did find is when we came down in one section of the home, the eastern portion, the orange square represents the center of the home. When we came down, we did find these two burned timbers, and we believe they're sleepers for a stairway. So there was a stairway that went from the basement up and to get out into the yard. But other than this, and other than the location of nails, there is no other wood that exists from the Enchanted Castle. Now here's the really cool part. Here we are, and we're digging away, and we're digging down. There's always been an oral tradition that there is a tunnel under the Enchanted Castle that leads to the river. Tradition is being that they had this tunnel, of course, that when those nasty Indians came by, that they could get away and run down to the river and escape. And of course, that's not true. We know most of the Native Americans were gone by the time this was constructed, but it's still a pretty cool story. You go, every home had a tunnel. None of them really did. We were digging down, and all of a sudden we found stairs leading down underneath the basement. So what you see here, this upper portion where the striped stick is, that's the basement floor. And what happened is we started digging down these stairs, and all of a sudden they turned, and lo and behold, we actually had a tunnel, which shocked us, because they really did have a tunnel. Excuse me. What we think happened is the tunnel actually probably led to a cistern or an underground well or some sort of chamber to use for food or wine for storage, rather than actually for an escape tunnel. First of all, the river is nowhere near them. And second of all, the way the angle shifts and the way it leads to, although it hasn't been excavated, it probably leads to more of a storage area. Most people now ask, how come you haven't dug it? How come you haven't done this tunnel? And then you say, because I want to live, because there's probably about 5 feet of debris on top of this tunnel that's been sitting on top of it now for hundreds of years, and so you cannot just tunnel into it. You actually have to remove the material on top and then shore up as you go, or also will be shut down by OSHA. So hopefully eventually we'll get a nice millionaire to come along and help us figure this out so we can excavate our tunnel. But yeah, Enchanted Castle really has a tunnel. As I mentioned, there also was 2 hyphens and 2 outbuildings that we also excavated at this site. This is a northwest hyphen, and again we have this very curious use of stone. The northwest hyphen's foundation is again schist. It's not brick, it's not even sandstone or any of the other materials they had around here. It was actually made of schist, and you can kind of see the line of what we're talking about for that hyphen. Based on the width of the hyphen foundations, based on the presence of window glass and other building materials, as I mentioned, they were likely enclosed, so they're probably not just walking spaces, but actually workspaces. This is the northwest dependency, northwest of the main house, which we're interpreting to be a kitchen or a laundry. It probably had 2 separate rooms inside, and you can see the wonderful brick herringbone floor that this one did have. The 2 peculiarly shaped fixtures here on the west side are very unique. Most people, we're not exactly sure what they are. Some interpretations are laundry features or beer brewing features. And so hopefully we'll be able to do some more research in the future to figure out exactly what they are. One is a rectangle, and the other one's perfectly round. So they're really very unique, constructed of brick. The southwest hyphen and dependency are also pretty unique. The southwest hyphen is made of brick, so it's just really interesting. They have stone and brick kind of in an alternating pattern depending on what you're talking about. But the southwest building itself is, again, made of schist. It's just this very weird way of building this home. And this one's even more odd, because what they did was they took this schist I was talking about, how fragile it is, but they took these enormous sheets, 4 feet by about 4 feet. Now you can imagine, and probably about 2 or 3 inches thick, and they put them vertically in the ground. And they put them on the outside as a form of weather protection. So they put it on the side. Now think of it, if you have like a mica or a slate, or if you guys know any of those kind of materials that fracture that way, when you turn them on their side, they're extraordinarily hard. You know, you can't break them that way. And so you have this piece on its side, and then they piled waster pieces on the outside to kind of hold it up. And that's what created the foundation of this building. There was nothing like any home that was built at the same time. This feature you can see here is a fireplace box, and again, it was also built of this very friable schist material. And why do I think this building was built in 1718? Most people originally thought 1724, but based on archival research, I believe it was built much earlier, and this is why. We do know that Spotswood had another home prior to this one of Germanna, probably about 1716 to 1718. This is down at Fort Christiana or Christiana in Brunswick County. In 1718, House of Burgesses closed Fort Christiana, and he was not having good relations with them anyway at the same time. So for many reasons, he abandoned the home of Christiana about this time. So there he was with all these enemies in Williamsburg, and he needed someplace else to go and prove himself to build this monument to himself. We also know that diary entries from John Fontaine, which are written about 1715 and 1716, don't mention a home at Germanna. So you know it couldn't have been built earlier than that time. He was very specific about what he did describe and did not describe, and he never mentioned a home there. So we can pretty much say that it was not there before that time. And again, because of this turmoil, he decided that he wanted to have another home outside of Williamsburg. Now, also at this time, we know that there are 2 groups of Germans who came in. The first group came in 1714 to establish the fort. It was a much smaller group, 42 folks. The second group came in 1717, early 1718, and it was a much larger group. So in total, when these 2 groups got together, because they did overlap for several months, there was quite a large population out here. In addition, right about this time, when Spotswood did start acquiring slave labor, so he also had that kind of labor available to him to help build this property. We do know the home was under construction in about 1720 based on the writings of Hugh Jones, a historian. And we know that Spotswood was in residence in a home at Germanna by 1721. And that's because of a court case. Mary Peel was one of his servants. Apparently she started dressing in his clothes, and he found out and he got very upset about it. And good stuff. And so we know that he obviously was in residence long enough to have clothing at this home and to have goods at this home for this woman to do this. So by 1721, there had to be enough of a home for him to live in, and it takes a long time to build something that's this large. So that's why, again, I say about 1718. We also know that he was in full residence by 1723, so the main house itself had to at least be partially completed by then. And the court records also show by 1724 it was completed. So how was this mansion built? We discussed very briefly the stones, why it was different. Let's go a little bit of detail about how exactly I came across some of my conclusions. And these are some of the numbers that were in the paper. And I showed this to my dissertation committee, and I said, here are 85,000 reasons why I should pass my dissertation defense, because I counted every single one of these things, and I'm crazy. But in total, and keep in mind, this is only about 20% of the site. We've already recovered about over 22,000 pounds of brick, 11,000 pounds of schist, slate, sandstone, white mortar and mud mortar, 2 different kinds of mortar, 2 different kinds of plaster, over 27,000 nails, and over 25,000 pieces of window glass. All weighed, all noted about where they came from exactly within the site. Bricks we found, again, were all locally made using sand as a temper, and they're all made here on site using wood molds. They also made pavers or more square bricks that were thinner to use for flooring. They're all made here on site. Here's some examples of the slate I mentioned. Again, it came from right along the Rapidan River. And again, the most intriguing thing I think about the slate is that it took another 40 years for anyone else to use Virginia slate for a roof. I think it's pretty incredible. Even when William Byrd, his colleague, mostly colleague at that time, built his home Westover, he imported English slate for his roof. Spotswood, or someone that he knew had the knowledge of the geology to use Virginia slate to actually build his roof. There's a lot of carved sandstone out here. The architectural elements on this home are absolutely amazing. He had carved sandstone columns, carved sandstone pilasters, which are flat pieces of columns, pieces of moldings along the bottoms, marble in his fireplace. It was very ornately decorated. This was not just a humdrum type of place. Someone had also had to be around to find this sandstone and then have the skill to cut it. Here's some column bases that are actually made out of sandstone. Which again came from between about 5 and 9 miles from this site here. Of the window glass we found, probably about half of it was burned. So it was melted. And that's why there probably was a lot more actual fragments of window glass, but a lot of it was in clumps. So you couldn't really count the clump that it came out in. But of the pieces that you could count, there were over 25,000 pieces of it. And it was probably spun glass, which means it was brought over from England by actually taking globules of glass and spinning it fast so it creates a sheet on it. Again, the nails, we had all sorts of nails, most of them obviously hand-wrought, handmade at the time. Most of them, anything from little tiny tacks to really big construction nails, we found them all over the site. The amount of nails was really pretty incredible. Sorry, I told you about these materials. Now the next question everybody says, okay, well, what did it look like? You know, it's so hard to look at this very static, flat foundation thing and try to figure out what this home actually looks like. I mean, most of us will drive by a home and look at its facade and try to figure out what it actually looks like. No one actually kind of crawls on the roof and tries to look down to see what a home looks like. So what did the home look like? To figure this out, I took all those measurements I told you about and I did some distribution maps. In other words, I looked at the quantities of them to figure out where they're located on the site. Now, if there are concentrations of artifacts in a particular area, it might mean, say, that they were built by a certain type of artifact at a certain place. And I did the Surfer maps. The Surfer is a computer program. I did them for every single type of architectural material to try to see if I could find some idea of what this thing might have looked like and how it might have functioned when it was actually an operating home. This is a close-up of the one of nails. I put the orange as the outline of the Enchanted Castle on top of it, and what you can see is the portions that are darker means that there were more nails. And the portions that are lighter obviously mean there were less nails. Now there's obviously two very distinct blobs, we'll call them, right in the middle of the main house. And if you look at it, one of them is located to the right of the cross-shaped chimney, and one of them is located to the left of the cross-shaped chimney near a secondary, very small chimney. And I interpreted those likely to be areas of stairways. They would have made sense because we know he had an entry hall in his home, and there also probably was a second interior stairway used for servants. So I interpreted as the fact that these might be a main stairway and a secondary stairway. The two areas here on the left, we found actually large quantities of artifacts in here as well. They could be from interiors of the outbuildings or just dumping episodes. When the Gordons, the families in the late 18th century, purchased the property and built their own home, they kind of spread everything out. So what we see isn't exactly how Spotswood left it, but it's still a pretty good approximation of that. So what did the home look like? If you looked at it from the front, which would have been the north or more the riverside, it was a 2.5-story home. If you looked at it from the road side, or the south side we'd be facing to it today, it would have been about 1.5 stories tall. So it was built into the side of a hill. So you saw 2.5 stories on one side, but only 1.5 on the other. The exterior is part brick and part stone. It's a very odd combination of the two of them. And we know they had sandstone and marble ornamentation. It had columns. It also had an exterior porch. It probably had a hip roof, with, we know it had slate shingles, and it had several dormers. Part of the reason we know about how many stories it had, part of the reason we know about all of this is because Spotswood did leave a will. And anyone who's done any historic research, you know that what usually happened was the people after he died, they wrote an inventory of the estate. What you do is you basically walk from room to room to room and record everything in each room. So while you have to try to decipher exactly how they walked through the property, you can still kind of get an idea of the flow of what rooms were in order in a home. So I was able to look at his inventory and try to figure out how many rooms had windows, for example, and how many rooms had beds, and how many rooms had tables. So I was able to figure a little bit more about that. We do know that there was a porch on the whole north side, had at least 2 chimneys, because there's 2 fireplaces. And we still look at the shape. It had a big forecourt out front that basically was where people enter the home. And here for the first time I'm introducing what the home might have looked like. Aren't you all impressed?
Yes.
You are the first to see this. This is my interpretation of what the Enchanted Castle looked like. And again, this is just my interpretation, and I'm far from being an artist. What this is, you'd be looking at the home from the north. So you see 2.5 stories. You see it had many windows. It probably had, because the main story would have been on the 2nd floor because of the way the topography was. If anybody's been to Stratford Hall, you know you have to walk up a flight of stairs to get to the main floor. I think it was something like that. Well, it had to be something like that because we know the 2nd floor was the main floor. So you will probably had some sort of stairway, whether it was monumental or not, that led up top. We know it definitely had a porch that extended the whole width of the 2nd floor, and it was probably supported by ornate columns. It definitely had dormers piercing the roof because we know that people lived up on the 2nd floor, and you had guest chambers up there, and they probably had windows. And the reason that the chimneys are colored different colors is we know that there definitely was a central chimney, and there definitely was the chimney that you see on the right. He could have put a chimney on the left to make it symmetrical. It's not unheard of. At Nominee Hall, for example, they only had 3 fireplaces. He had 5 chimneys because he wanted to make it look symmetrical. Very likely Alexander Spotswood did the same thing here, even though he did not actually have a fireplace in that location. The brick thing you see there on the side, that's the cistern that I mentioned. It was right in the side yard, as they probably had a cistern, and then those are the enclosed hyphens on either side. Now, it's very hard to understand exactly what the scope of this is and the scale of this is when I show you a picture like this. For that, and I think to most of us, you kind of look at it and you go, yeah, so what? You know, it's not very grand. But that's what the average home looked like in Virginia at this time. That's the size of it. And I think that gives you a much better idea of what we're talking about. The average home is probably about 15 feet or 20 feet by about 10 to 15 feet wide, made of wood, posts in the ground. This is what Spotswood lived in. A little bit of difference between what they had and what he lived in. I think it gives you a better idea of what we're dealing with. And so the next question is, how was this home organized? How was it actually lived in? And this is my interpretation of how the home was used. This is the basement of the home, and again, this is based on archival research as well as artifact distributions I talked about, and a little bit of knowledge about how people lived at this time. This whole basement was used by servants. It was not used as any sort of formal living space. We also found no evidence of fires in the fireplaces down there. So it's unlikely that people actually inhabited these rooms as, say, servants' quarters. They were probably just used for storage or used for food processing, those kind of issues. The portion down the bottom here where the drain was is probably a wine cellar, and I say that because we do know that Coratoman, King Carter's home, he also had a drain that's described similarly, although without stone, and he used it as his wine cellar. So there is a chance that that could be a wine cellar down there. You see stairways. We do know we had stairways going up, leading out. So the servants had stairs going up the main floor, and they also had stairs going outside. So you have, here's a fireplace that was base that we found here. Here's a cross-shaped fireplace. Here's a drain, which is probably a wine cellar, maybe a wet storage here. Now these are the stairs that led down into the tunnel. We showed you the stairs leading from the tunnel, and here's a tunnel leading off in this direction. Here's stairs going outside here, and stairs going outside that direction. So I interpreted those stairs, again, to be used by servants, people doing work down in the basement, and that's kind of how they got to the rest of the plantation and the rest of the home, was by exiting these stairways. Subsequent to my research, Mary Washington College, I graduated from there as Mary Washington, so I'll call it that, I suppose the University of, they did a study on all of these ceramics that came from the site, and it's really very intriguing. Here is their density map of pipe stems found at the site, and you can see the amount of pipe stems that were found directly outside that stairway was tenfold to anywhere else on this complex. Now let's think about modernity. You know, what do people do when they go on their break? You go out the back door and you have a cigarette. You know, that's what they do today. We're seeing the exact same thing likely occurred at the Enchanted Castle. You know, you're going out the back door because town was this direction. Spotswood's bedroom was this direction, so you're going out the side door and you're having smoke before you take a break, before you go back and you do your work. It really is pretty incredible the way that worked out. So my interpretations could be right. Here's my interpretation of the first floor plan. So here we have bedrooms. Probably, we know it definitely had an entry hall, because William Byrd mentioned one in his, when he wrote down about it in his diary. It had, obviously had some sort of parlor. And my interpretation was that the rooms to the upper left side that you see were Spotswood's suite. They were probably a study and his bedroom. It had a private fireplace, and it also were the rooms that overlooked town. And so I think, knowing what we do know about Spotswood, he liked some sort of control and to observe his kingdom and to observe the people, what was going on, and he likely made that his own bedroom. Now, we also believe he had a dining room based on the inventory I mentioned. And if he did indeed have this dining room, it's one of the first formal dining rooms in Virginia, if not the United States, because before this time, no one had dining rooms. It was this part of this new ideology that came about to have a separate space to eat in, to have that control of your meal. So if he did have a dining room, it was really pretty important. And to go, and a couple more that show you the slides that Mary Washington came about with their ceramic inventory. This shows the concentrations of the ceramic called white sac-lay stoneware, which would have been the plates that Spotswood ate off of. And you can see that they're more concentrated on the left side of the main house, which is kind of interesting. And then here's a second one, and this shows a ceramic called lead-glazed red wares, which are very coarse wares that we're usually used in kitchens or laundries or servants' areas for more mundane tasks. They're very utilitarian wares, and once again, we happen to see them near where they thought the kitchen was, and near where they thought the laundry was, and near where the cistern was. So it's you're starting to get more interpretation that some of these thoughts actually might be correct as far as where I thought these things were. Some things are actually starting to come together, which is pretty exciting. Here's a summary. It was built between 1718 and 1724, designed by Spotswood himself, but obviously he didn't build it himself, he had other laborers. It was built using almost all local materials. And it was built on top of the Fort Germanna site, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. So they had this big cleared area, and he built his home. It was destroyed by fire and then repeatedly burned and robbed after that time.